It was almost real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast, episode 115. Hello and welcome to this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. My name is Ken Zimmerman Jr., and this is the podcast dedicated to the history of professional wrestling from the 1860s to 1930. And in this episode, I will be talking about Frank Goch's brief foray into professional boxing. But first, I'm going to change the format of the show up a little bit this week. And I'm going to start with the recommendations, go to review, cover the main content, and then end with the update. So for the review that, or I'm sorry, for the recommendation this week, I want to recommend the 1985 Wrestling Observer Yearbook. I've been reading the 1985 Wrestling Observer Yearbook, and I learned that Dave Meltzer almost quit publishing the Observer in the middle of 1985. Think of how much wrestling history would not have been covered properly had Dave Meltzer decided to go become a soccer journalist, and that the bookkeeping for the Wrestling Observer was just getting to be too much. What I liked about the issue, though, was it covered the wrestling wars, as so to speak. We're 2 years into Vince McMahon really starting to try to take over the wrestling business. He bought the company in 1982, but he didn't make the final payment, I think, till sometime in 1983. You can see already by the middle of 1985 that Vince is going to win this thing running away, even though his wrestling isn't all that great and the product isn't all that great compared to what some of the older promoters were putting out there. He was far and away. The only real competition he had was Jim Crockett and Jim Crockett Promotions, who might have survived and might have been a viable number two company to this day had they not tried to go national. Had they stuck to the South and the Southeast, they probably would still be around to this day. But they decided to go national as well, but they didn't have the business acumen of Vince McMahon. One of the things that Dave points out in the Observer for that year, Vince went to the annual convention of cable broadcasters, and he also went to the annual convention of the people that were putting out VHS tapes at the time. No other wrestling promotion was even thinking along those lines, which is why Vince had such a leg up with both television executives and the people in the home video market that he would eventually get into. My other recommendation for this week is nothing to do with wrestling. It's actually a mystery series, and it's the first book, and there's, I think, 15 books in this series as of right now, and I think I've read 8 of them already. The first book in the series, which if you have Prime, it is available on Prime so you can read it for free. It's called A Deadly Affair by Carla Simpson, and it's about the former Metropolitan Police officer. And this is all set in Victorian England, but it's about a former Metropolitan Police officer named Angus Brodie and sort of an adventurous author named Michaela Forsyth. And she ends up consulting him about a disappearance of her sister in this first book. And they end up becoming friends and then something more and partners in this investigations. And yes, there is romance in it. So if you're like 10 years old and you're like, I don't want none of that romance stuff in my murder mystery, then it's not the series for you. But I found it to be kind of quirky, a little different. And it's, to me, with my historical bent, this investigative team solving crimes back in Victorian England around the time of Jack the Ripper, I found to be pretty interesting. So that's my other recommendation for this week. And I will have links for everything in the show notes at kenzermanjr.com. slash episode 115 for the last episode in 2025. The next time you hear from me, it will be 2026. The review that I wanted to do this week is actually comparing two cards from 1925. So in July and August of 1925, we're in the first couple of months of the divided championship era. Stanislaus Zbyszko has double-crossed Wayne Big Mun in Philadelphia in April of 1925. And then in Memorial Day 1925, Stanislaus Zbyszko drops the title to Joe Stecker, which was always the plan. And that occurred in St. Louis in front of 17,000 fans at Slough Field. And after Zbyszko drops the belt to Joe Stecker, Wayne Big Mun, who has a disputed title recognized in Illinois and Michigan because Billy Sandow was able to get the commissions there to refuse to recognize Stanislaus Zbyszko's legitimate victory over Wayne Big Mun in Philadelphia, he holds the title for Illinois and Michigan, which he drops to Ed Strangler Lewis. And so for almost the next 3 years, you have not only a divided championship, you have a divided promotional groups as well, a promotional war, and the groups are the promoters and wrestlers aligned with Billy Sandow, Ed Strangler Lewis, and then the wrestlers and promoters that are aligned with Jack Curley and the Stecker brothers. So you have these two competing world championship claims from two competing promotional groups. These promotional groups tended not to run in the same cities. For example, Lewis defended his title in Tulsa, Oklahoma, but he didn't go to Philadelphia or New York. Joe Stecker defended his title in Philadelphia and New York and Atlanta. Lewis and Sandow did not tend to run those towns during this time. However, there were a couple of exceptions. The first exception was Chicago, that already had two promotional groups, and they basically just aligned with different promotional groups, and they both ran Chicago, but never on the same cards, never with the same promoter. The other town was Los Angeles, but they had an established promoter in Los Angeles by the name of Carnation Lou Darrow. And since there was not already a second established promotional group in Los Angeles, Billy Sandow got the great idea that he was going to go ahead and create a promotional group in Los Angeles. Today, we would call that going outlaw. Well, today. In the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, we would have called that going outlaw. But back in the 1920s, there was no recognized territories. No one was recognized as they owned the territory. It was going to be very hard to move Jack Curley out of New York. It would be very hard to move John Contos out of Atlanta. But you could try. You could run a rival promotion. And you had the same situation in LA. Carnation Lou Darrow was going to be very difficult to unseat as the promoter of record, but they went ahead and they started another promotion down there. And the first person that promoted was a red-haired Irishman by the name of Kenneth Dix, personal friend of Billy Sandow's, and Billy Sandow tried to establish him in LA. Dix realized it was going to be a money-losing proposition pretty early, and after his first or second card, he leaves. But Sandow still has another couple businessmen try to get a foothold in LA for another couple months after that, and then they just give up, and they don't run Los Angeles until we're getting close to when Lewis and Stecker are going to wrestle a contest to establish the undisputed world heavyweight champion. This is early on in that almost 3-year period. So on Thursday, July 30th, 1925, in Vernon, California, Kenneth Dix runs his first event in Los Angeles. And on his card, he has 4 matches. These are all wrestlers that are associated with Billy Sandow's promotional group. So in the main event, Joseph Toots Mott, who's also Ed Strangler Lewis's training partner and a legitimate hooker, is wrestling Alan Eustace. The winner of that match is supposed to wrestle Wayne Big Mun the following month, and the winner of that match will wrestle Lewis for his version of the world title. In the co-main event, a newcomer to the promotion, but who would make big waves in the 1930, Dick Schickett, another legitimate hooker, is wrestling Herman Stroh. In the second bout, Pat McGill, who was also legitimate hooker on the smaller side, but would be a training partner for Ed Strangler Lewis in his training camp when he was preparing for the reunification match in St. Louis with Joe Stecker in February 1928. McGill wrestles Hans Bauer. And then to fill out the card, Dix gets a couple of local wrestlers. One is kind of more famous as a physical culturist and someone who preferred raw foods. And his name was Professor C. Bragg, and he's going to wrestle Jack Brown in a middleweight bout. So this is not a heavyweight match. This is a middleweight match between two local wrestlers, a good opening match for the card. Carnation Ludero, on the other hand, will run 2 weeks later at the new Olympic Auditorium, and this is Carnation Ludero's inaugural card at the new Olympic Auditorium. And this card is going to be held on Monday, August 10th, 1925. I'm pretty sure Los Angeles was a Monday night town, and it ran about every 3 weeks during this time. In the main event, Joe Stecker defended his version of the world title, which he had the strongest claim to the world title, against Renato Gardini, who, if memory serves me right, was a Olympic wrestler on the Italian national team in the 1912 Olympic Games. And I'm going off the top of my head, but because he came to the United States, I believe in 1914, I think that that's correct. I think he was with the Italian national wrestling team in the 1912 Olympic Games. So he is a legitimate legitimate shooter. I was putting shooter and hooker together, and we had a shooker. But no, he was a legitimate shooter. He could wrestle amateur style wrestling, but he was not a hooker. He was not skilled with submissions. In the co-main event, Stanislav Sabisco, one of the greatest shooters ever in wrestling, was wrestling Don Andreas Castanos. And then in the opener, two future world champions, Jim Londas, who was still, he was not the box office draw he would become in the late 20s or early 30s, but he was well on his way. His time in St. Louis really helped make him into a nationally known wrestling star. He is going to wrestle Jim Browning, a Missouri wrestler who was a good enough shooter and hooker that when they double-crossed Londas in the early 30s, they put the championship on Jim Browning because they knew Jim Browning could handle himself. But in this match, they're cooperating together as members of the Stecker group, and they're wrestling the opening match. The card or Dix's card drew a couple thousand people. Ludero drew 6,800 fans to this inaugural card in the Olympic Auditorium, which is probably why the upstart promotion only lasted a few months. Dix, again, I'm going off of memory because from the researching the Divided Championship, I think he lasted 2 cards. It definitely wasn't more than 2. It could have been a single card, but I'm pretty sure it was 2. And Carnation Lou remained the powerhouse promoter in Los Angeles until I think he passed away, I'm pretty sure, and the promotion was taken over. Eventually, it would be taken over by Cal Eaton. But I think that there might have been one person in the interim before Cal Eaton, or that was Cal Eaton's partner in the promotion. So the main content for today's episode, the main historical content, was something I had actually forgotten about. And when I was working on the website the other day, I came across and said, well, that would be a good topic for the podcast because it's not, well, it's changed a little bit with the rise of MMA, but you still hear all the time who would win between a boxer and a wrestler. And I don't think that that's the greatest question in the world because, one, it always depends on the rule set. But with all things being equal, I think 8 out of 10 times I'm being generous. I think it's probably more closer to 9 out of 10 times or 98 out of 100 times. The wrestler is going to win because as soon as the wrestler gets their hand on that boxer and gets them off their feet, the boxer is helpless. Now, all those bouts start on their feet, and there are plenty of cases in history, Damian Maya versus Nate the Great Marquardt, where they start standing up and a guy was dominating the person on the ground, but he gets knocked out before he can take him back down. You always have the puncher's chance. But normally what happens is what you saw when Randy Couture took on James Toney. The boxer gets taken down, and then they're helpless once they're on the ground. And that's usually what happens most of the time. That's not what was going to happen here, though, because what Gotch was trying to get set up, because it would have made a lot of money, was not a wrestler versus boxer bout, but a boxing match. Well, for initially, let me walk it back just a hair. Initially, I think Emil Clank was trying to get a boxer versus wrestler match between Frank Goch and James J. Jeffries, who was the world heavyweight boxing champion at the time. And this is all happening in late 1904, early 1905, when Gotch has just won the American Heavyweight Wrestling Championship from Tom Jenkins again. Gotch was not seen as having a lot of credible challengers. Jenkins was his only real credible threat. And in their competitive matches, they were 3-3. Jenkins won 3, Gotch won 3. Now, Gotch ended the series with 5 wins to Jenkins 3. But as we're going to talk about why he was even interested in this boxing match, Jenkins had taken a job after he lost the title back to Gotch with the United States Military Academy, West Point, the military academy that trains the Army officers for the United States Army, as the defensive tactics instructor and the physical training instructor. And from that point on, Tom Jenkins was semi-retired, and he really didn't belong in the professional wrestling ring anymore. I don't think he could turn down the money that he got, and Jenkins did not work matches. So when Jenkins wrestled somebody, he wrestled them legitimately. But because he could not devote himself to the training like he had once done, he would lose to guys after 1904 that he would have never lost to in his prime. So while Gotch has 5 victories to Jenkins 3, the last 2 times he beat him was after Jenkins took the job with the U.S. Military Academy, and he was not the Jenkins of old anymore. So it's early 1905. James J. Jeffries has run out of contenders to fight in boxing. But, and there's a big but, the reason he ran out of contenders to fight in boxing is he strictly drew the color line and would not fight the great African American fighters. And at that time, the greatest fighters in the heavyweight ranks were all African American fighters. Jack Johnson, Sam McVeigh, Sam Langford, Joe Jeanette. These guys were all monsters that could have given Jeffries a run for his money, but he just strictly refused to fight any African American fighters. So the white fighters at the time that were challenging Jeffries were no match for him because he was so much bigger than most of them and had a real strong knockout punch. Gotch, after beating Jenkins, is not seen as really having any great contenders either. And so, looking for a big money fight, both of them, they start entertaining thoughts first. And I think that what killed this was Jeffries didn't entertain that thought for long. First, it was going to be a wrestler versus boxer match. But I think Jeffries thought, if I get in there with Gotch, if I don't get him with that first shot, he's going to take me to the ground and tie me in a knot, and the match will be all over. And for that, he was absolutely right. That's exactly what would have happened. Gotch would have taken him to the ground, tied him in a knot, and it would have been all over with. And he probably would have got headbutted and thumbed in the eye on the way down because Gotch was not above using dirty tactics to win a match. The difference between Gotch and a Evan Strangler Lewis. Gotch was nasty and could be dirty in the wrestling ring, but it was a tactic for him to win a match. If he didn't need to do that, he didn't do it. If he was superior to the wrestler, he didn't follow him. He had guys try to take liberties with him that he kind of laughed off because he knew he could beat him. But if he got in there with a Hackenschmidt or a Jenkins, he'd thumb him in the eye, he'd headbutt him, he'd palm strike him, and Jenkins would just do it right back. But Hackenschmidt couldn't handle that. A gentleman wrestler, he couldn't imagine fouling his opponent like that. So Hackenschmidt kind of had his, or Hackenschmidt, Gotch kind of had his way with Hackenschmidt in 1908 because Hackenschmidt would not resort to the dirty tactics that Gotch would use so frequently. Jeffries was well aware of Frank Goch and how he wrestled, so he probably knew that was a bad idea. So Jeffries' camp says, we won't wrestle or we won't get into a mixed styles bout with you, but we'll box an exhibition with you. Which Gotch said, okay, that sounds, because they knew that would make a lot of money too. Just like Conor McGregor fighting Roy Mayweather Jr. That was going to be a big money fight. Not Roy Mayweather, Floyd Mayweather Jr. They knew that was going to be a big money fight. I'm confusing all these names today. Roger Mayweather with Floyd Mayweather becomes Roy Mayweather. We've got shooters and hookers becoming shookers. He will do the boxing match. So Gotch says, all right, well, to generate some interest in this, he's going to box Gotch. Frank Gotch is going to box a match with a boxer. So he schedules a friendly exhibition with a friend of his who's a Canadian heavyweight boxer by the name of Sam Williams. I'm sure that this match or bout, it was not a match. I'm sure that this bout was just supposed to be an exhibition. Sam Williams was going to make Gotch look good enough that it would seem plausible that he could give Jeffrey some kind of a bout so that they could get fan interest in this bout and split the gate and any gambling proceeds that came from it. However, Gotch caught Williams with a heavy blow and actually knocked him to the ground. And when he knocked him to the ground, Sam Williams' arm got trapped underneath him and it injured his arm. It was an accident that Gotch felt horrible about because it dislocated the guy's shoulder. He fell so awkwardly on that arm that it was visible to everybody that he had dislocated his shoulder. He had to, be helped from the ring and all of that. And they said Gotch looked sick to his stomach and felt horrible because he had hurt a friend of his who was trying to help him to look good for this bout with Jeffries. Well, it all turned out to be a fool's errand anyway, because Jeffries retired in May of 1905. So 3 months after they have this bout with Sam Williams and they're trying to get interest in an exhibition, Jeffries decides he doesn't have any more challengers. He's made enough money and he's going to go to his alfalfa farm in California. That ends Gotch's brief foray into professional boxing. I think that if they had had the mixed bout, it would have went pretty much the way Jeffries thought it would have gone. Gotch would take him to the ground. Gotch would tie him into a knot. And if he was lucky, he wouldn't end up with something broken. So I'm going to end this week's episode with the update. And part of this update is I'm going to talk about the podcast plans for 2026 and why you had an episode this week when I had originally said that I was going to take this week off. So the first thing I want to say is I was able to get the St. Louis Civil War out the door on December 21st. So it has been published and it is available on Amazon in ebook, audiobook, paperback, and hardcover. I've decided on my next project already, and one of the subjects I'm going to write about is Harry Hill, who was one of the early. He was more an organizer, backer than a true promoter, but he was the head of that collar and elbow group of wrestlers that were working matches in the 1860s and 1870s. And he's a fascinating character, so he will be a future podcast topic. But I'm going to do the book I was going to do on the 19th century wrestlers that they don't have enough of a career that you could do a full book on them. But if you put together a number of those stories, you have a book length project. And it's going to be a pioneer wrestling book from the 19th century. That's my next project. I did want to briefly talk about the WWE AAA event, War of the Titans, from December 20th, 2025. I've said many times on the podcast, I've become a fan of the AAA promotion. Not a fan of all the matches, but I do like the promotion, and it's available on YouTube. So I'm trying to keep to, if I actually share my thoughts about something that I've seen, that it's going to be from YouTube, so it's available for everybody. And so I watched that card. I think I watched the card live, but it may have been the next day. I can't hardly remember. This week has been pretty busy. I took my rascals for the first time to the History Museum. So I used to take my three kids and my nine nieces and nephews. My sister had a 15-passenger van, and I used to borrow it, and I would take the 12 kids with me to the History Museum once a year. So a lot of times my sisters and my wife would go on women's weekend back when my kids were little. So I would take vacation from work, and then I would borrow her van, and I would take my three kids and my nine nieces and nephews with me to the History Museum. And they were all my TKD students, so they all listened to me very well. And we would go to the History Museum every year. And they're all adults now, and they all still talk about the trips we used to take. Well, I took my grandsons for the first time this past week of Christmas. So they got to see the Missouri History Museum, which was built with the proceeds from the 1904 World's Fair. Most World's Fairs lose money, but St. Louis had one of the few profitable ones. It wasn't a great deal of money, but it was enough to build a history museum after the fair was over. And then the next day we went to the St. Louis Zoo. The three of us did because everybody else was working. And so it's been a pretty busy week. So if I'm a little scattered today, it's because of the week I've had. And I do apologize. I hope it's not affecting the quality of the program too much. Getting back to this card, the first match was a four-way tag team match, which was lots of actions, people lying around, not my cup of tea. I was, I don't know, happy to see Canelo Alvarez at ringside, one of my favorite fighters. The next match was one I thought I would like a lot more than I did. This is the match, not this match, but the match that the same two competitors had on the last NXT card, which caused me to turn the NXT show off. And that was the match between El Hijo del Dr. Wagner Jr. versus Ethan Page. One of the things that, since I've been watching AAA and I've gone back and watched some of their historical matches that they have on their channel, El Hijo del Dr. Wagner Jr. is someone that I thought that I would like quite a bit. He's the third generation of Dr. Wagner's. His father had one of my favorite matches that I've seen on AAA with El Macias, who, if you've watched Puerto Rican wrestling WWC, I think it was WWC, but it could have been IWA, in the late 90s or early 2000s, he was Ricky Banderas. They had a match between Dr. Wagner Jr. and El Macias, and that was one of my favorite matches. So I already, because of his father and his grandfather, El Hijo Dr. Wagner Jr., the son of Dr. Wagner Jr., the third Dr. Wagner, I expected to like a lot more than I have because he looks like an athlete. He has a great entrance. I mean, he's not super muscular or anything like that, but he looks like an athlete. And I've just not been able to get into his matches yet. And Ethan Page is very talented, but every once in a while, they do stuff like they did in that match on the NXT show that it just takes me out of it. This match overall wasn't that bad. I didn't like it as much as I thought I would, but I did like the false finish. I thought that was a nice little touch. The next match was between the Wyatt Six, and I just called them the Clowns, but it's Pagano and Murder Clown and the other two luchadors that always wrestle in the clown outfits. And to quote the men on film from the 1990s in living, or 1980s and 90s in living color, hated it. Did not like that match. Left me a little flat. The next match is one that I didn't think I would like as much as I did, but it was the Laredo Kid versus Javon Evans versus Jack Cartwheel. And while I think there's too much gymnastics in wrestling today, all three of these guys perform it much better and more believably than most of the stuff you see. And I found it an entertaining match, and I'd watch all three of these wrestlers again. So kudos. I thought it was one of the better matches on the card. The next was Los Toxicos versus Natalia Neidhart, Fabi Apache, and Lola Vice. And Lola Vice is one of the people that stood out to me when I first started watching AAA because she's on a lot of their cards. She's got a legitimate background in martial arts, comes out there, gets the crowd into her matches, and I think everybody in the world has pinned her. Her team finally did get a win, so Lola Vice finally got a win, but she didn't actually get the pin. Her booking has left me a little puzzled. And then the last match on the card that I was looking forward to, and it did not disappoint me, was El Hijo del Vikingo versus Dragon Lee. And El Hijo del Vikingo should be their top guy, whether he's a baby face or a heel. I think he's uber talented. The only thing you can take away from him, and he can't do anything about this, is he's on the short side for a professional wrestler, but there's nothing he can do about that. All the things that he can do something about, he does very well. And I like him better as a heel right now than when he was trying to be the baby face for the company. The match was entertaining. I like the ending, and them putting that big stiff with him is perfect. So if you haven't seen the match yet, go out of your way to see that match on YouTube. Finally, and the reason you got an episode this week, Dan and I in 2024 had come up with a plan for the podcast. What we had decided on was we would put out a podcast every week with the exception of the second Monday of the month. So that would come out to be about 40 episodes a year and 12 written blog posts. That was the schedule we were going to go with to start 2024. But of course, Dan got sick, and that plan went out the window pretty quickly. Flash forward to the end of 2024, the beginning of 2025. Dan had been in the hospital or the SNF for most of the year, but he was starting to make progress at the new skilled nursing facility he was at, to the point where we thought that he would be coming home probably about this time, until he had his setback during dialysis, and that led to him going back into the hospital. We found some other issues they didn't know about. He got an infection, and unfortunately, that led to other serious medical complications. He passed away at the end of April. And I started to do the podcast weekly. Part of that was to try to deal with the loss of Dan, because doing this reminds me of the times we spent doing this. And my sons have helped me with a couple of episodes, but they were never wrestling fans. They were doing it to support me, but they're not really interested in doing it. So I've primarily been doing the episodes by myself. And that will probably continue. They will join me occasionally. My grandsons may join me occasionally. Maybe I'll have one of my brother-in-laws that used to watch wrestling with me come onto the podcast occasionally. But for the most part, it's going to be a solo podcast dedicated to the history of professional wrestling. So I'll be covering history topics every month, every month. I'll be covering history topics like I do every week. And what I'm going to implement for 2026 is that schedule that Dan and I came up with in 2024. So you will get a podcast every week. That's why you're getting the podcast this week, is because adhering to that schedule, this would be a week that you would get a podcast. So the blog post that I wrote will come out on January 12th, the second Monday. So there will not be a show on the second Mondays in 2026, but every other week there will be a podcast, which comes out to be about 40 shows, which that's enough for anybody to hear me talk at any one time. My grandson is actually amazed that I can speak this much. The first time he came onto the podcast, he said, "Papa, you've been speaking a long time." And I said, "You didn't know Papa could speak this much, did you?" And he said, "No." So that was quite a revelation for him. But that will be the schedule going forward. So we'll have an episode next week, the first episode in 2026. January 12th will be a blog post, and then there'll be weekly episodes for the remainder of January. I think next episode may cover Harry Hill, or if it's not Harry Hill, we will cover him before January is out, because I think he's a fascinating character, and understanding his background, he was also a collar and elbow wrestler from England, but understanding his background and how he became such a force in boxing and wrestling in New York will help set up to understand how we had that first working group in the 1860s and 1870s in collar and elbow wrestling. And that group would eventually include Homer Lane, J.H. McLaughlin, and John McMahon. Henry Moses Duffer, who wrestled all those guys, actually was not part of that ring. Duffer is one of the few guys that I'm discovering. I may, as I research his career for this new book, may change my mind, but so far Duffer is one of the people that I'm not sure he ever worked a match. We'll have to see. I can only say that about Tom Jenkins, George Hackenschmidt, and maybe Henry Moses Duffer now. But the other three definitely worked matches. That's it for this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. Until I see you again next week when we ring in 2026, KenZimmermanJr.com is the place to check out the show notes for today's episode. You can find the show notes at KenZimmermanJr.com/episode 115. You can also see what I'm working on currently in a list of books that I have written if you're interested in digging deeper into this era of professional wrestling. Thank you for listening today. I would also be grateful if you would rate the podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to the show. That helps tremendously in keeping the podcast visible and helping people that have not heard of the show to discover it. If you'd like to comment on the episode or ask a question, please just drop me an email at ken@kenzimmermanjr.com. I would love to hear from you. And until next week, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.